I've just come across a report on MSNU. Sometimes that gives me sort of topics to discuss, and this is one that I may have covered before, but it's been a while, and it's around the subject of veganism. So basically, this morning it's a UK talk show, which, as the title suggests, is hosted or is broadcast in the morning by ITV. There's a sort of competition show, competitive show, Good Morning Britain. But anyway, I digress. Um, and there was a debate between a vegan activist and a woman who produces her own meat that she kills. I won't read out the whole report, but just read out the first few sort of paragraphs to give you the idea. This morning, viewers have slammed a guest for being rude, inverted commas, as the debate on veganism spiraled out of control live on air. Things got very heated on the ITV show on Friday morning, which was being presented by Eamon Holmes and Ruth Langsford, when two guests disagreed immensely on Veganuary, or Veganuary, I'm not sure how that's intended to be pronounced. As vegan Joey Armstrong and meat eater Rachel Carey debated on the movement which sees people go animal product free for the entire month of January, Langford was forced to step in. As Armstrong spoke over Carey during the segment on the Loose Women anchor, intervened and said, Joey, you seem to be very angry about this. It almost seems like you can't listen to the opposing view. Armstrong snapped back and said, you should be. The earth is being destroyed. Holmes also tried to calm down the warring guests, although I have to say it was Armstrong that was really being more verbally aggressive. But was shut down by Armstrong. It's an expression I hate, but he asked the host, have you been to a slaughterhouse recently? No, Holmes replied. Armstrong fumed. Exactly. I have heard pigs scream for their lives. I visited a slaughterhouse in Manchester. Viewers flocked to social media with a reaction to the TV argument. I'll just read out one of these because there's a lot. This vegan guy is annoying. Let the woman speak. She didn't butt in when you explained why you're a vegan. People like this are the reason non-vegans find vegans annoying. Another person wrote, well done to this morning for choosing angry extreme vegan activist for January. What a way to represent vegans and vegetarians. From Sophie. So she's obviously saying that sarcastically, like it's misrepresentation. Unless I'm mistaken, I've seen this guy before. He's an Australian. He's a prominent vegan activist, and he's known for direct action sort of tactics, or for being very vocal on this. Unless I'm mistaken, and I take this full responsibility if I'm getting this wrong, but this is the guy that led uh, or was one of the leaders of this sort of method of blocking aisles. So, for example, going into a supermarket and actively blocking people from buying meat products. Right, let me just look at some of the things with this and my stance on it. Firstly, I am a meat eater, but I wouldn't describe myself as a meat lover. What I mean by that is I can't eat vegetarian options. I don't have to have meat with every meal. I'm not such a meat lover that I absolutely need it with every meal. Um, I think that this is a movement that's growing. It's still a minority, but it's a growing minority. So, in any sort of economic situation, it's supply and demand. So, as you have a growing demographic, then it makes sense that they are more catered for. So, that's why we're seeing, for example, vegan options in Greg's and other businesses. I have no problem with that. That's something I'm totally, makes sense. I do think it's a little bit misleading to call a sausage roll vegan when it's a sausage roll. Call it a sausage influence roll or something like that. It's a slightly dishonest thing I find with the vegan movement is that have substitutes, have the vegan options, but don't call them something that they're not. This might sound like a trivial point, but it's just dishonest. You know, naming a meat product vegan, and maybe it is vegan, but it's just call it influenced by or flavored or something like that, but not either it is or it isn't meat. You can't sort of mess around with words and try to sugarcoat it. If you're going to go for a vegan option, then just call it. non-meats, or describe it as. So when I see things, for example, as vegan burger, vegan meat inspired burger, or something like that, that's not precisely the terminology, but what I'm driving at is, if something's going to be vegan, then don't pretend it's some sort of, it's pretending to be meat, or at least be honest. Say this is influenced by the taste of meat, something like that. So maybe people who like the taste of meat, but vegan activists are trying to get them to go, to encourage them to go down the vegan route. Don't call it meat. It's not meat, and that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having the option. But anyway, the thing about Veganuary or Veganuary, again, I've no problem with any movement trying peacefully influence how they feel about things, but that is a big caveat. It needs to be peaceful, and it needs to be in a reciprocatory manner. So, for example, the conservationist and former wildlife presenter Chris Packham, I know he's been at the centre of this sort of debate, and I haven't followed it closely, but the impression I get is he's going for the conciliatory approach. It's better to have discussions with meat eaters rather than just trying to shame them into changing. I'm not a big meat eater, but I certainly wouldn't appreciate if a vegan came up to me and told me, "Oh, you're a murderer for eating that beef burger," or whatever it would be. I mean, the vegans who seem to be taking that approach, they're going to have a very uphill struggle, because whilst veganism has increased, it's still a significant minority of people. And that also brings me to a few questions about the movement. I mean, I've always understood the argument for vegetarianism because there's ethical issues about slaughtering animals for human consumption. There's ethical issues around, for example, battery hens. I totally get that. And I've been to parts of the world where consideration for animal welfare is almost non existent. And even as a meat eater, it made me pretty uncomfortable seeing the way animals were killed. I mean, this isn't to say that we're much better. Although I suppose there is an aspect that Westerners don't like to see how it's done. In the East, people are less bothered about seeing the gory side of it. So perhaps that's hypocritical on the part of the West that it still goes on here. But although I would say that we have more stringent rules on animal welfare overall. But this is a very emotive debate. I think that people who see that animal suffering, animal welfare side of it, they they take it to heart. They understandably feel a sort of emotional connection to that. And I think when you've reached that point, it's very hard to go back. It's very hard not to have emotions on this. And I personally don't think it's comparable to human rights, but I mean, when it comes to the issue of human rights, that's not something I can mentally compromise. I will always be uncomfortable or angry when I see blatant human rights abuses. So I guess from a vegan point of view, they cannot change their gut feeling on that. And I respect their conviction. But they're not going to win the argument by just shouting people down. And that's what this guy seems to think he'll achieve. I have seen him before. The more I think about it, when I do recognize him, and he just comes across as obnoxious. He comes across as a bit of a bully because he believes in just shouting people down. He comes across as a pretty unpleasant character, and he may even have the right argument. But no movement has ever won by those sort of methods. It just hasn't, because people watching this will just say he's shouting over the woman, and it's not a gender issue. It would be the same if it was a guy that he was shouting over. It's just that is not the way to win an argument. I think if he'd been calm and if he just made reasoned arguments rather than just trying to shout over everyone, it would have been, I mean, it's not like he was being denied a platform. He was being given a platform to put forward his point of view. And what's significant is a lot of vegans criticised him. So they obviously don't want to be represented by someone who thinks they win the argument by shouting over people. I know of both vegetarians and vegans who dislike those within their community, for want of a better term, who think the way to win these arguments is by trying to shame meat eaters. My sister's a vegetarian, and we ate Christmas dinner. She was there, and she didn't make us feel bad about it. And I know plenty of people who I mean, that's vegetarianism, of course. With veganism, here's an issue or a contention or a question I have. Vegetarianism, like I say, it's the ethical thing around eating meat. I can understand that. But with veganism, it's any sort of animal product whatsoever, including dairy products. Now, you take cattle, which have been domesticated for thousands of years. What happens if we suddenly make a transition, which people like Mr. Armstrong want, a sudden radical transition to veganism? What happens to the millions and millions of domesticated farm animals? What happens to them? Are they simply released into the wild? Are they put down? I mean, what is the ethical argument for a sudden transition in that sense? These are domesticated animals. They wouldn't, it doesn't take a genius or a conservationist to work out that they wouldn't survive on their own by just being freed. Okay, over time they would adapt, but initially I would imagine you would have a lot of animals just dying off. And I think that's just common sense. I think you cannot have a sudden transition that drastic without serious ecological consequences. Um, I think there are many arguments to be made for issues around conservation, particularly with endangered species. So, for example, not many people buy into the argument of trophy hunters that they do it for conservation. But when it comes to domestication, pigs, cattle, sheep, I think most people, even vegans and vegetarians, would recognize you cannot have a sudden transition. From what I've seen, most vegans actually advocate a gradual process rather than a sudden drastic process. Now, it may be that over time, in 20 years and 30 years and 50 years, it could well be that 50 years from now, the demographics have shifted to such an extent that the meat industry will have significantly declined. Yes, there is an issue of jobs in that. There are many, many people, this is their livelihood. And that is always a challenge when it comes to these sort of debates. Now, vegans, I've heard them, for example, compare their cause to the Holocaust, which inevitably provoked strong responses. I've also heard them compare it to the slave trade. And what they've said is, well, with the slave trade, there were economic arguments against abolishing it immediately because it was an industry. Grotesque as it sounds, that was an economy, and there were people profiting from it. There were jobs involved in it. Although everyone today recognises that it was grotesque. Well, most people do. But if vegans want to make those sort of analogies, I think they need to be aware that most people simply do not put animal welfare on parallel with human rights. They just don't make that moral connection. I think most people, particularly in Britain, for example, would feel disgusted when they hear about an animal being tortured by, say, drunk yobs, right? I think attitudes in this country are very much for that sort of push for animal welfare, for cracking down on that sort of wanton cruelty. But when it comes to the meat industry, things get a bit murkier because if we see an animal being tortured, people say, "Oh, that's disgusting," arrest the brute. But when it comes to abattoirs, we know it's there, but we don't have the same moral outrage. So vegans then take the shock tactics. I've seen them even here in Sunderland. They have laptops to show abattoirs. I've never understood the whole mask thing. To me, that's a bit weird. I don't see what that's supposed to indicate. The shock imagery, I actually do understand. I understand why they're doing that. Will it work? Well, does the shock imagery on cigarette packaging work? Does that stop, seeing someone with some horrible tumor inside their throat? Does that suddenly stop someone smoking? Not necessarily. So certainly there will be people who will be moved to change their dietary behaviour from seeing abattoirs. But I think veganism, the issue is that it's for too many people, it just goes too far. It's all animal products. It isn't just meat. It's even dairy products. Now, from what I gather, their issue is it's immoral to use animals for any sort of human purpose. But centuries of domestication, milk products, for example, doesn't harm the cow, unless I'm mistaken. And I would stand corrected if anyone can prove that it does. But extracting milk from a cow's udders, does that harm the cow? I've seen no evidence that it does. So where's the moral argument there? Sheep shearing for wool, does that harm the sheep? The wool grows back. Where's the moral argument there? With meat, I get the argument because the animals are slaughtered. And in this country, we hope that the law is such that it's done in the quickest way possible, and there's debate around that. I think both sides are somewhat dishonest. I do think that the meat and poultry industry is sometimes dishonest about their methods, but I also think that the animal, like the radical vegan movement, to put it one way, can also be dishonest. So, for example, I saw them somewhere in the States go into a factory. It was a poultry factory, and there were thousands of chickens, and this was, battery sort of conditions. So that is the moral argument is obviously there against that. But they showed an image of a bird that had died, and they used this to kind of show that how awful the conditions were. Now, what the owner responded was, "Well, we have 100,000 chickens. If you take 100,000 people in a demographic situation, you're going to have older people who pass away for a range of reasons. So just as people die, chickens die." And that got me thinking that sometimes this is not black and white. Not everything is as it seems. Now, I have no doubt if I go into an abattoir, if I see a pig or a cow being slaughtered and hear its screams, there is a strong chance it would maybe move me enough to transition to being a vegetarian. In terms of nutritional arguments, I'm not an expert on that. So I cannot talk about to what extent protein, iron, all that sort of stuff factors into this debate. Certainly, some people need certain things more because they have a depletion in particular areas. Perhaps they're allergic to something and they need to make up for it in another area. But again, I don't want to get into an area which I know very little about. Well, frankly, nothing about, because I'll just embarrass myself if I try. Anyway, what I would say with this is it is obvious that there is a gradual but obvious thing happening. Now, personally, I am not a huge meat lover. I do not, for example, I find meat on the bone quite off putting. I find it quite, I just don't like it. It's awkward to eat, and I don't like the look of it. But am I ready to make a big transition? I'm not so sure that I am. But if it did go that way, I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I wouldn't be a hardcore meat defender. But I think that, those vegans who don't like being represented by guys like Mr. Armstrong, who just think the argument is to shout people down, they need to be representing more reasonable vegans who are saying, look, this is our argument. We're not forcing anyone to do anything, but at least listen to what we're saying. By the same token, as a meat eater, I have seen some meat eaters use an approach which I don't like either. I mean, I've seen some meat eaters kind of gloat about it, and they'll actually like show pictures of a roast steak or something just to provoke vegans. Now, I think that's wrong. I do not think that is a good way to win an argument either. It looks quite petty. It looks actually quite nasty. I mean, if someone feels very strongly about something on moral grounds, why go out of your way to try and provoke them? It's very different if you're minding your own business and having, a meat dinner and some vegan comes up to give you a hard time, then they should mind their own business. But, and it reminds me actually, because this weighs into the argument, I remember there was a program, First Dates, I believe it was called, and there was a young guy, and girl, and the girl was a meat eater and he wasn't. He was a vegan, and he immediately got into this thing about making a big issue about his veganism and trying to make her feel bad. And this was supposed to be a date. Well, great way to win the girl over, buddy. You don't. you don't make her feel guilty. And he really did lay it on, like, oh, you're murdering my friends and stuff. And vegans underneath were saying this guy does not represent us. So again, it seems to be the loudest vegans get the most attention. Um, but as a meat eater, I don't think meat eaters should gloat about it either. I think we need to recognise that vegans have sincerely held beliefs, and I personally respect the strength of their conviction. I wouldn't take kindly to anyone lecturing me on my diet, but I respect it. I do respect the strength of their feelings, and I am not totally closed minded to the possibility of someday doing that. My own situation, economically, there are certain things that I do in my diet which, because of my economic situation, it is just more convenient to get, for example, cooking meat. I get cooking meat which I put in pasta. Now that lasts quite a long time. It's in my economy. I am not financially stable right now. That works out for me in a way that the vegetarian options simply don't. Um, I could put, for example, some vegetables into the pasta, but I just don't get the same satisfaction from it. And that is a basic practical aspect of this, which I think a lot of vegans don't understand, or I should say, some vegans don't understand. Some people just like the taste of meat, and they don't want to give it up. They have tried the vegetable alternatives, perhaps, and they just don't find it satisfying. And in the end of the day, we eat for nutrition, we eat for sustenance, but we also eat for pleasure. So you need to make vegan options attractive, and they need to be cost effective as well. I'm not saying that they're not. I think we're sort of seeing that transition, but not so long ago, vegan products tended to be, only you'd only get them in Holland and Barrett or something. Now, that is changing, so it may be that the whole supply and demand argument comes into this. I'll round this up soon. I would just say this. Both sides need to be respectful of one another. At the moment, we meat eaters are in the majority. And I believe that being part of the majority needs to be respected, but I also think we need to respect the sincerely held convictions of vegans. So if I know someone's a vegan, I'm not going to go on and on about meat in front of them just to work them up. I have seen meat eaters in this argument come out with that. And actually, I'll say this, as a meat eater, this might even sound hypocritical, but for example, around Christmas time, you see the thing pigs in blankets. Now, it's harmless, but personally, I'm just talking on a personal level. I'm not demanding anything be changed or anything like that. I mean, pigs in blankets, it shows happy little pigs. Well, this is meat. It's not happy little pigs. It's meat that's been cut up for our consumption. That's what it is. And that's not bad. It's just what it is. So when I see these little images of happy little pigs, pigs in blankets, it kind of makes it nice and warm and cuddly. Let's be honest, that's not what it is. Okay, this is meat, covered in meat. It's not pigs in blankets. It's meat in meat. So things like that, I find a little bit. That would be the sort of thing that might be a building block to eventually making me a vegetarian. I would definitely not transition to veganism immediately. If I was going down this path, I would go to vegetarianism first. But this is where militant vegans, I think, are wrong, because they even give vegetarians a hard time. They'll even say, "Oh, well, you're a hypocrite. You're not pure enough because you still drink milk." Things like that. That's where any movement that takes that sort of zealotry is going to polarize people, and not in a good way. This guy Armstrong just strikes me as very pompous, very self righteous, and very irritating. And I think that sort of attitude, all it does is polarize people. But he is so sort of stuck in his own little bubble of self righteousness. I'm right, and the rest of these meat eating barbarians are wrong, that he can't rationalize it, at least by using that language. It polarizes people. So I do respect the strength of feeling that vegans have, but I think they also need to understand that a sudden drastic transition isn't going to happen. And I'm genuinely curious to know what happens to all the domesticated animals if we did go for a drastic change. I think a gradual change over this century might be plausible, but it's going to be. It would be radical because millions of people around the world, their livelihoods depend on agriculture. I mean, Argentina, for example, a huge part of that country's economy is in the beef industry, and there's many other examples. There's pretty much no country on earth that doesn't have some level of meat consumption that's a significant part of its national diet. So, I mean, China, for example, virtually the only people that are vegetarian or vegan are Buddhist monks, or people who maybe in rare cases have allergies. But a country like China, they mix meat in with everything. So getting, if it's this much of a challenge in the UK, where there's probably a higher rate of veganism and vegetarianism, how do they think it's going to happen in developing countries where agriculture is still extremely important? So these are all questions that need to be addressed.